Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final day, the fifth day of the most wonderful festival in the world, the Z Jaipur Literature Festival. It's such a pleasure to have you here at Samvad. We like to think of this venue as Mount Kailash because it's a beautiful neutral zone surrounded by birds, nature, peacocks, cows. So don't be perturbed if you hear some animal sounds during the session. They're just showing their appreciation for literature. So without further ado, I would absolutely love to introduce our next panel. But first of all, could I just make sure that everybody's telephones are turned to silent? It's such an important thing to show respect for our panelists. If you could please do that. And if you do have an urgent conversation, please just take it outside as a form of respect. Thank you so much for that. So now we begin our next session, the Begum and the Countess. We are welcoming to the stage wonderful authors Deepa Agarwal, Tamina Aziz Ayub, Rhiannon Jenkins Sang, who will be in conversation with TCA Raghavan. Please give them a warm welcome to the stage. And just to tell you a little bit about our moderator while they're taking their seats, TCA Raghavan is the former Indian High Commissioner to Pakistan and Singapore. His first book, Attendant Lords, Bairam Kar and Adur Ar-Ramin, Courtiers and Poets in Mughal India, won the Muhammad Habib Memorial Prize. And his second book is The People Next Door, The Curious History of India's Relations with Pakistan. Now, I would please, if you would help me warmly invite to the stage our beloved festival director, Namita Gokhale, who is also a founder of this wonderful festival. She's also a writer of 18 books and a publisher, the founding director of Yatra Books, a publishing house specializing in translation. Please, a warm welcome for Namita.
Dear friends, a warm welcome to you indeed, to all of you for being a part of the festival. And on this last day, this session is the session which is perhaps closest to my heart. I'll explain why in the course of this short introduction. Today's session, The Countess and the Begum, looks at two important and charismatic figures who inhabited the same timelines and were both key players in the tumultuous tide of events that led to the partition of India and the creation of Pakistan. Rhiannon Jenkins Sang's book, The Last Vicereine, is classified as fiction, though that may be just a convenient labeling, which we will find out in the course of the session. Through the voice of a spectator and a friend, it follows Edwina Mountbatten, the last Vicereine of India, whose husband, Lord Mountbatten, oversaw the transition of power to independent India and drew the lines that demarcated the two nations. The Begum, a personal memoir, is an important collaborative biography, co-authored by Deepa Agarwal and Tamina Ayub, for which I have written a bridging introduction. It is a well-researched portrayal of an intrepid and passionate woman, presenting her personal narrative and political convictions, and also mirroring the history of our subcontinent in a timeline truncated by the harsh realities of partition. The two women knew each other and had contiguous lives. They met at social events and dinner parties. Edwina reached out to prominent Indian ladies to help Lord Mountbatten in his negotiations with their husbands, their fathers, their brothers. To quote from a book on Edwina Mountbatten's colorful life, she says in her diary, "Attended a private party given by Begum Liaquat Ali Khan to enable me to meet the ladies of the Muslim League. A fantastic evening." My co-director, William Dalrymple, had posted on his timeline a list of invitees to a dinner in 1947 to celebrate Lord Mountbatten's silver wedding anniversary. His father, William's father, Captain Hamilton Dalrymple, was among the guests, and seated across him was Begum Liaquat Ali. Or rather, in the seating plan which Willie had put up on Facebook, the Begum was sitting facing Mrs. Indira Nehru Gandhi. Across her was the Excellency, the Vicereine, It is interesting that Sir Cyril Radcliffe was also in the same dinner, as were so many other figures from the recent history of the Indian subcontinent. Well, we couldn't be at that dinner, but today's discussion will bring some of those aspects of those times to life for us. Begum Rana Liaquat Ali Khan, born Irene Ruth Margaret Pant on 13th February 1905, to an apostate Brahmin lineage, was a practicing Christian till 1933. She was a professor of economics in Delhi's prestigious Indraprasth College. After her marriage to Liaquat Ali Khan, she converted to Islam and was renamed Gul-e-Rana. This fiercely independent lady, who carried her myriad identities within a core self of unchanging conviction, departed the world on 13 June 1990, living to be 88 years, and she was known, recognized, and honored as Madar-e-Pakistan, or Mother of Pakistan. School children in Pakistan have read about her since in their textbooks, since they were very young, but we in India have forgotten how she was part of our lives too. The first half of her life was spent in undivided India, where she transited two religious identities and repudiated a third through her grandfather. With almost mathematical precision, her 86 years were divided into 43 years plus some months in each of her two lives. She was an intimate witness to history, the two nations, the bifurcation of East and West Pakistan, the creation of Bangladesh, the course of the Cold War, the rise of Gorbachev, and the increasingly unequivocal hold of the army in Pakistan. From Jinnah through Zulfikar Bhutto and on to General Ziaul Haq, she spoke her mind and held her own. Where and how did she get this steely resolve and infinite reserve of strength? How did she negotiate the transitions and transformations of history with such seeming ease? I've always been fascinated by this formidable woman and her ability to stand tall in an overwhelmingly patriarchal society, even after losing her husband with no grown male, indeed female relatives to support her in the newly birthed nation of Pakistan. I do not claim to be a historian, and my role in writing this introduction arises from the desire as a novelist, as a woman, as an Indian, to understand the complex chain of convictions and actions, the immediate and historical sources, as well as the accidents of fate and destiny that dictated the course of her life. She was born Irene Pant. We share maiden surnames, a common ancestry. I was born Namita Pant. Faded family tree documents these connections with a branch cryptically cut off. With his conversion to Christianity, her grandfather, Taradat, had placed himself outside the pale of caste and kinship. Yet, whenever I encountered the half-told tales of Begum Rana, I could sense the mountain grit in her, the legendary strength that comes so naturally to Kumaoni women. I wanted to know more about her, to understand her as a determined woman, a thinking, feeling human, a creature of her times and circumstances. So it was serendipity that brought me into contact with Deepa Agarwal and Tehmima Ayub, both of whom, their different styles and approaches match the different phases of her life as they have documented them. Deepa's anecdotal account traces the life of her protagonist from the blizzard that accompanied her dramatic birth to the storms of life she was to so bravely face. We follow her through school and college, through the personal and the political, until that final departure in 1947 to another country and another life. Tehmina Ayub's more formal biography documents the young First Lady of Pakistan, the visionary founder of the All Pakistan Women's Association, the diplomat, stateswoman, and Madar-e-Pakistan, who left a stamp on her unique personality on all that she did. Tomorrow, I'm thinking, tomorrow, the fest. Together, these two segments built up to a magnificent portrait of a free-thinking woman, the epitome of glamour and grit. She remained non-political after her husband's tragic assassination, and her unfading mystique resonates all the stronger for that. I've been a political mystery all my life, she is quoted as saying. I will do it again and again, 10 times over, she declared in the later years when confined to a wheelchair. So between this book and this life of Begum, And between the life of Countess Mountbatten, we have a picture, a mosaic emerging here under the able moderation of T.C.A. Raghavan, who knows history and the gossip behind history and the stories behind history. And I think I'm going to go back on the stage and watch this totally riveting session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Namita, for that introduction. And do, ladies and gentlemen, read Namita's introduction to the book, The Begum. Now, the two books we are going to discuss this morning, and I think it's a wonderful idea of the JLF to put this session together in this way. The first of them is The Last Viceroy, which is a novel around the lives of Edwina Mountbatten, and the second is the book called The Begum, which is a dual biography. Now, The Last Viceroy is a novel, as I said. It's set in 1946, 1947 in New Delhi, as all the politics around the partition unfolds. But it's actually also two stories. One of them is the story of Edwina Mountbatten, and the other is the observer who is writing the novel, so to say, a close companion by the name of Leticia Wallace. So you have these two wonderful stories woven very sensitively into one. And we learn about Edwina Mountbatten, her background before she came to India in terms of her role in the Second World War, what exactly happened in 1946, 1947 in New Delhi, her experience of a full range of Indian politicians, their wives, the many interesting women who dominated the Indian national movement and the Pakistani national movement at that time. The second book is a biography. Now, it's a unique kind of biography because, as you heard Namita say, the life of Rana Liaquat Ali Khan, who was the wife of the first Prime Minister of Pakistan, really falls in two halves. She was a girl from Kumaon, highly educated, came from a family, they were high caste Brahmins of Kumaon, but converted to Christianity. Rana Liaquat Ali Khan studied very hard, had an MA in economics at a time when women were not highly educated, was a professor of economics in the Indraprasth College in Delhi University, met Liaquat Ali Khan, converted to Islam, became his wife, and then plays a major role in the politics of the Muslim League and in events leading up to the partition. So the first half of the book is written by Deepa Agarwal, and Deepa Agarwal is herself from Kumaon. So you have a unique perspective of how a life has been reconstructed. Because someone told me this morning that Rana Liaquat Ali Khan has largely been airbrushed out of history. Not many people know about her in India and her life in India till 1947. So that part has been very, very carefully deconstructed. And the second half is her life as wife of the first Prime Minister of Pakistan, then his widow, because he was himself assassinated in the prime of his life. And thereafter, she becomes an ambassador of Pakistan, becomes governor of a major province of Pakistan, but most of all is a protagonist of the women's movement in Pakistan. And that part has been written by Tehmina Aziz Ayub. Now, it's a unique book because it could have only been written by an Indian and Pakistani working together. So it's a wonderful thing to talk about, and I'm so happy to have these three wonderful authors on stage. Now, let me begin by talking a little bit about Edwina Mountbatten with Rhiannon. Rhiannon, why did you get interested in Edwina? Is she a very important figure in the UK today?
Do I just talk at this? Can you hear me? Yeah. She isn't an important figure in the UK today, but I've always been fascinated by the history of India, so I've always read books about British India particularly, and always the relationship between Edwina, if I might call her that, and Pandit Nehru has been dithered about, tactfully, shall we say, by historians. It's mentioned in a flying paragraph. So I became fascinated, kind of obsessed almost, by this relationship that obviously happened, but that people didn't want to talk about. And the more I started to research, the more fascinated I became, because simply it's just the most amazing love story. As a novelist, I was fascinated by the idea of two older people, because they weren't young people when they met. Nehru was tipping towards 60, I think. Edwina was in her 50s. So we weren't talking about teenagers falling in love. We're talking about mature people with complex histories, complex backgrounds. Pandit spent years locked up in English jail. There's a whole Romeo and Juliet aspect, or Antony and Cleopatra aspect going on. People who are from opposing sides of the fence, if you like, who, despite the political differences, were the greatest of friends. That fascinated me. So it was an obsession and a fascination with the story.
What comes out, this is a novel, incidentally, and it's a novel about Edwina told through the eyes of her close companion, Leticia Wallace, excuse me. Now, what comes across very clearly in the beginning is that when Mountbatten is appointed, or going to be appointed as Viceroy, Edwina comes to Leticia and says, please come with me to India. But what also comes through is that she's most reluctant to go to India at that time.
Yeah.
Now, why is that so? Because for a British politician in the making like Mountbatten was, his wife surely would have been pumped up that my husband is going as Viceroy.
No, she didn't want to go to India. The first thing to say is the Mountbattens had what we might call a very unconventional marriage. They both had friendships or liaisons on the outside of their marriage. All sorts of things have been said about their marriage, rumours whether they're true or not. But the fact is, their marriage was in difficulties. Their marriage was not in a good state in the winter of 1947, when Attlee and the King asked Mountbatten if he would take up the post of Viceroy. So that's the first thing to say. Second thing to say is Edwina started her life, she was a rich lady, a playgirl, if we want, a socialite. And she really was a bit of a wild thing, and she didn't have much purpose in her life till the war came along. Then she suddenly found a role for herself, working in the Red Cross and the St. John's Ambulance Brigade. So the war, in a sense, gave her a purpose in life. And she was very involved in looking after refugees during the Blitz in the UK. She went off to the Far East on liberation and was one of the first people to work with the prisoners of war in the Burma-Thailand Railway, the Australian and British prisoners of war. She was massively involved with relief work in post-war Europe. So she had a life of her own. I suspect she wasn't getting on very well with old Dicky Mountbatten either. This
sounds familiar. Is this something like Princess Diana's own story?
Yeah,
this upper-class girl
yeah.
who is not scared about getting her hands dirty,
yeah.
and in fact finds her personality by working with people. I'm
so glad you've said that, because when I was trying to pitch my book to sell it, I did actually make the comparison to Edwina Mountbatten, to Princess Diana. They say that Princess Diana was the first royal to kind of go down on her knees and cuddle babies and, you know, touch people with AIDS and all the rest of it. Well, Edwina Mountbatten was doing this, you know, years and years before. And, yeah, she found a purpose in life. She was a very bruised and unhappy person, which I think is why she had many lovers as a young woman. And there's no secret about that. That's in her biographies. She did have many lovers. And I think that was because she was a very unhappy young woman. And, yes, she was a kind of Princess Diana, yeah.
Now, in the book, there is a fascinating conversation between Lord Mountbatten and Leticia at one stage, and Mountbatten is obviously under a great deal of pressure, under stress, and he suddenly confesses to her that I advanced the date of our departure and of the final partition of India because I couldn't bear seeing Edwina so unhappy. And I had promised her that we won't stay in India for too long, and this is my way of trying to see that we leave as quickly as possible. Now, how credible is this?
Well, when you look at there's a lot of memoirs and histories and diaries written by people who were living in Viceroy's house at the time. and were intimately associated. And when you read these, what comes out is the fact that the Mountbattens were rowing every night. People could hear them, you know, husband and wife going at each other, hammer and tongs every night. They were profoundly, their marriage was in a complete state of breakdown. So it has been hinted at by historians that he promised her before he left that he would wrap up the job very quickly. I don't know, but I might suggest that maybe he wasn't very happy that she was friendly with Pandit ji. I don't know. That's not in other history books. That's my speculation. But there is, as always in history, there is the personal and the private, and how somebody's personal state of mind impacts on the kind of political decisions that they have to make is an area perhaps for a novelist. You could argue that the reason that Mountbatten brought forward the date for the transfer of power was because all the governors from the provinces were telling him, you know, we're sitting on a powder keg here, we can't keep control, we can't hang on, we can't manage it. So you could argue that he had a decision to make in the spring of 1947. Do I hang on or do I cut my losses? Now, the reasons for that decision might have been many, but perhaps his marital status might have been something that impacted on
Perhaps.
that.
And we all know that there's a point at which history ends, and that is where fiction begins, and which is why we have this wonderful recreation of New Delhi in 1946, 1947. And there's a great deal about, it was, I suppose, very unusual at that time. You have the Viceroy going on to refugee camps, women being drawn to her and coming to her with extraordinary requests. There's this wonderful story, and possibly there is some factual basis to it, about a young boy, both whose hands were cut off, and the Viceroy tries to see what can be done about this medically.
That's actually a true story. I forget which camp it was. It was one of the camps that's now up over the border in Pakistan. And I went to the archives to look through Lady Mountbatten's papers. They're all there if you want to go and look at them. And there are hundreds of letters from people in camps to Edwina Mountbatten asking for help or thanking her for help. And in the reports, there's an official dispatch written by an ADC who is with Edwina. And this boy is named in this dispatch. I think he was a Muslim boy who'd had both his hands cut off by, well, Sikhs or Muslims. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. This child, it doesn't matter which side. Let's not get into that. The child had both his hands cut off. And his name is recorded in dispatches. And it's clear from the name, from the way that it's recorded, that they were all desperately upset by this, and that they had, in the notes, it says, note to ask for prosthetic hands, note to go back to Delhi and see if we can get some prosthetic hands for this child. And actually, I was deeply moved by going through the papers of Lady Mountbatten. I actually came out and cried one night, because they're not just the story of the boy that has his hands, but there are hundreds of letters signed by women, particularly in Indian script, and somebody's written the letter in English, and they're saying, "Dear Viceroy and Sahiba, we beg you for help. We need rice, we need baby milk for our children, we need medicines for our children, we need vegetables, fresh vegetables for our children, and we are very sorry that we can't entertain you in the manner that we would like to, and please, Viceroy and Sahiba." And she did. She got them stuff. She got stuff to people in camps. And then on the other hand, there are letters saying, "Viceroy and Sahiba, thank you so much for these list of dal and vegetables and that you've got us." And it was just a human story, and I cried. So I put it in the book.
So this is a story of a very glamorous woman, but she has a life which is informed by public service. And it's also a story of a marriage which is internally possibly has broken down, but it has a perfect public facade. And we'll keep both these points in mind, because we'll come back to that. But I want to ask Deepa about Rana Liaquat Ali Khan, and in fact the prehistory of Rana Liaquat Ali Khan, because here's this Pant girl coming from an ostracized family because they've converted to Islam. And it's a wonderfully reconstructed life. There are no records. She had to go and find relatives, friends, to talk about Rana Liaquat Ali Khan as a young girl, as a student, and finally as a professor. So how difficult was it finding out about Rana's earlier life?
Well, I hope, can you hear? Yes. You know, Raghavan, I had heard about Rana Liaquat Ali Khan from childhood because we are a small Christian community in Almora, and her younger brother and my father were close friends. And it was, you know, a matter of great pride for us that she was the wife of the first Prime Minister of Pakistan, Begum Liaquat Ali Khan. That's what she was always referred to. And we kept hearing she's become the ambassador here or a governor. So that was quite fascinating for me. And it just so happened that her nephew, Jitendra Pant, you know, we had been childhood playmates, you can say. And in between, of course, I moved away and we had lost contact, sort of. And somebody was researching Christianity in Kumaon. And he suggested that why don't we visit Captain Jitendra Pant. And Jitendra, whom I knew as Jitu, came out with a file, you know, a file of press cuttings. They're all interviews of Rana Liaquat Ali Khan taken in Pakistan, and also an account of the, you know, the outrage that was evoked in Kumaon when his grandfather converted to Christianity. You know, at that time, for an upper caste Brahmin to convert really shook society there because it was an extremely radical step. So at that time, the idea crossed my mind that this is a woman worth writing about. And I don't know, I kept toying with the idea until I actually, by chance, Namita and I met at a lit fest, and somebody brought up, you know, about, actually it was Amina Saeed who mentioned that, is this the area, it was in Kumaon, is this the area where Rana Liaquat Ali Khan was born? And then that is where the idea of the book began. But, you know, it was not easy getting access apart from all the material Jitu had. I had to go around digging, trying to get in touch with other relatives to see if they had any memories. And even getting out information from him, it took several visits. And because, you know, memories get scattered. And he was a very young boy, and he'd hardly met his aunt a few times. But I also dug into biographies of Liaquat Ali Khan. And that is where I got some information, visited IP College, the National Archives, wherever we could, you know, find any information. They're little tidbits, and I talked to this wonderful lady, Rati Sani, who was actually the, you know, daughter-in-law of her younger sister. And because Rana Liaquat Ali used to visit India later, she had something to contribute too. So it was just, you know, picking up a tidbit from here and a tidbit from there. But I must mention that writing this book for me was a kind of a process of discovery, and especially, you know, the discovery of, you know, how women's education developed in our country. And about Isabella Thoburn College, and then later Indraprastha College where she taught. And when I examined, you know, the correspondence when she was applying for a job, what struck me was the fact that this was a young woman with an enormous amount of self-confidence, because she writes a very peremptory reply to the principal who was, you know, offering her a job, that kindly send me a quick reply. You've delayed too long. And I thought of it, if someone applying for a job today wouldn't dare to do that. But at that time, she did it. And to go back a little, when she joined MA in Lucknow University. She economics, MA in economics. She was the only girl in her class. And she was, you know, ragged a bit by her fellow students. They would make caricatures of her on the blackboard, yeah, and or punctured the tires of her cycle. So you see, in the 1920s, this intrepid young woman, she would cycle to the university and prepare to face, you know, the onslaught of her fellow classmates who felt a woman had no business to be there in the economics, MA economics class. And, you know, apart from that, when she came to Delhi to teach, she was living all by herself in her, you know, something called the Girls Friendly Hostel. So I really discovered a lot. And I didn't know that such places existed at that time. And then also, you know, it's fascinating how she met Liaquat Ali Khan, because, see, again, the personal and the political merge here. And at that time, I think young people were all fired up, and especially when the Simon Commission came, and she attended this, you know, the session of the Legislative Assembly, and Liaquat Ali Khan gave a stirring speech, and everyone, all her fellow students were so impressed with him, and so was she. And she went to sell him tickets for the Bihar floods relief. And she, you know, she was the person she encountered at the Legislative Assembly. So here again, you see her zeal for social work, which comes up much later. And that is something, again, which she had in common with Edwina Mountbatten, doing work in the refugee camps, etc.
You have to think about it. It's such a dramatic story. Here's this girl from Kumaon, comes from an ostracized family, meets Liaquat Ali Khan, marries him, goes into the heart of the Pakistan movement. I mean, you have contrarian movements all the time in her life. Now, if I can come to you, Tehmina, how difficult was it, you think, for people in Pakistan in the late 1940s, early 50s, to deal with someone like Rana Liaquat Ali Khan? I know there were ripples, that people thought that she was too forward, she was too highly educated, but do you think she made a role for herself in Pakistan at that time?
You see, her role actually, I wouldn't really say began then. Her role began much earlier when she was...
Hold it to, yeah.
My mouth. Yeah. So, yeah, her role began much earlier when she began to work together with the Muslim League post her marriage to Liaquat Ali Khan, which was in 1933. And they were based in Delhi. And a lot of the Muslim League politics, the movement for Pakistan, started in full throttle then. And she became very much a part of that. So she already had a role for herself and an image that she built for herself as a partner to her husband, but also a woman of education, and who did a lot of the office work for him, and manned the office and did all the typing and correspondence and so on and so forth. So all of that started then, and then, of course, as 47 happened, and they all had to move on to the other side, she had to go with him. And I guess there were already quite a few leading women who had taken part in the Pakistan movement and were members of the Muslim League. You can count them on your fingers, though, but there were. So there was already the image that, yes, Pakistani women were partnering with the men in the movement. So, yeah.
Well, the interesting thing about Rana Liaquat Ali Khan, in contrast to the Mountbatten's marriage, this is a perfect marriage, because the husband and wife support each other at every stage. At one point, you describe how Rana Liaquat Ali Khan wanted to resign because there was too much criticism of his wife. Liaquat Ali Khan wanted to resign because there was too much criticism of his wife when he was prime minister. So it was a perfect marriage. But then that ends. Liaquat Ali Khan, at the prime of his life, is assassinated. And she is there as a widow. And then she makes another role for herself, first as ambassador, and then so on. So would you like to guide us through that?
Yes, yes. I will do that, of course. You see, because it was almost 47 when they came to Pakistan, and 4 years later, at a very big political rally in Rawalpindi, which is not very close to where they lived. They lived in Karachi, and she was in Karachi. And he travels to Rawalpindi, and his dead body comes back. So she was suddenly a widow, faced with life ahead of her with two small children, I think 10 and 12. And so the quandary was, will she continue to stay and carry on whatever she could? Not his footsteps, because he was prime minister, but to just stay in Pakistan and play a role. And I think she had no second thoughts. She had been so immersed in the whole movement for Pakistan that she was now wedded to the idea of Pakistan and to make something of it as a country. So yes, she had small children. She had no financial assets of any kind. Her husband had taken no compensation for their properties left behind. He had no money in his bank account. So there were close friends who came forward and said, look, if you're staying, we are there. We're going to give you any kind of help you need. And somebody even gave them a blank check, Mr. Jamshed Markar, who later became our ambassador, and said, this is yours. I know you're a proud woman, you're not going to ask anyone, so I'm just giving this to you. But then the government of Pakistan, luckily at that time, I think it was Skandar Mirza, they came to her rescue and they thought they will appoint her as an envoy abroad, a role she could do easily, and also would support her sons to study abroad, because then you get a kind of educational benefit for children if you're an ambassador. So she was appointed ambassador in 1956 to The Hague, and that's where she went. And at that time, Holland was ruled by a queen, so she found it quite easy to slide into the role.
Became great friends with the Queen.
Yes, role of an ambassador in Holland. And she stayed there for 6 long years. She became the dean of the diplomatic corps by the end of her stay. So that's one part of her career as an ambassador. And of course, she was able to, she had started a lot of work in Pakistan at the same time before she left. So she never gave that up. She continued, even from wherever she was, to run that. And one of them was, of course, it had come out of the need for welfare and, how do you say, refugee work, but it became a full-fledged organization called the All Pakistan Women's Association, APWA, which was set up in 1949. She became the president, and she remained the president till she died. So that was like her main project, and she never gave it up. And she continued to work with that and kept grooming people to continue, and it spread to all parts of Pakistan. Had branches in every province of Pakistan. And she had.
And she was later governor of Sindh.
That was much later when Pakistan had broken up into 2 parts, and Mr. Bhutto had come into power. And she felt, you know, that she had done all she could do in terms of, she was still into welfare work, but she'd done her 2 stints as ambassador, and she sort of wanted another platform. So he said to come into politics and fight the elections. So she said she'd rather not do that. She became a kind of advisor to him on financial affairs. She was an economist. And then he said, okay, I think I shall make you the governor of Sindh. And she reluctantly accepted that. And she continued with that till Mr. Ziaul Haq, General Ziaul Haq took over, and there was a dictatorship. And then she said, sorry, that is over for me now. I take a back seat, and I can now still continue with the struggle for women and their place in society. And she did that. She kept doing that till she died.
And she would be remembered in Pakistan today, of course, as the first Prime Minister's wife. But more than that, possibly people recall her work for women's education,
yes,
and what she did through the All Pakistan Women's Association.
She was a pioneering feminist. I mean, she was the first feminist of her kind. I mean, all the other organizations, movements came out of APWA. For the first time, she put women on the map, that the need to address the question of women's health, women's education, women's employment, economic empowerment, all these things, you know, she initiated through the platform of APWA. And yes, so she was an inspiration for all other movements later.
So what is there common between these two women? I mean, what gives them that grit, you think? And I'll come to each of you with that. Rohina, what do you think? I mean, what drove? Because you're silent on what happens to Edwina after 1947.
Yeah, I think they were both women of their time, and as you said, they were actually pioneers, both of them, in women's education. I'm struck reading the book about the similarities in the work that the two women were doing. You talk about the all-women's Pakistan movement, which it's kind of mirrors the all-women's India Women's Federation that was going on in India, and the kind of work that was done by the colonial people with the Minto nurses. So they are, both of them, working crusaders for women's education and wider participation of women in politics and civil society. That's what they were both. And I think the other thing that, I won't take too much time, the other thing that defines them in my mind, the two women, is that they were women of duty and public service, committed to duty and public service. And I think these are ideals that are going out of fashion today. You become a celebrity today. But the idea of duty and public service, I think, define them. And if I might just say quickly, we need to think and bear in mind here today the terrible price that both families paid for their commitment to duty and public service. You know, Liaquat Ali Khan was shot in his prime. Lord Mountbatten was blown up by the IRA. And you know, this is the price that both families had to pay for that. So duty and public service, I would say.
Deepa, Namita referred to, I think she called it mountain grit. Is there something about women from Kumaon which gives them this extra bit of grit?
Yes, I would definitely agree with that. You know, they live in very difficult terrain, and they have to grapple with a lot of, you know, like apart from the terrain, it's like even the village women, you know, who go out to the forest to gather wood, cut grass. They are faced suddenly with, you know, sometimes with wild animals. There's so many stories about, you know, they just defend themselves with their sickles. If there's a leopard suddenly attacks them, or a bear, you know, there's so many stories of women, really strong women. And this is a rather strange story of women in a particular district. If a bear came to attack them, they would entice them to the other side of a tree, and they would catch hold of the bear's paws and rub him against the tree till he was badly wounded and gave up. So these are the stories I grew up hearing. And of course, it's a very hard life for women in Kumaon because the land is not that fertile. They're tiny fields. It's a struggle to raise food, to take care for their families, and carry water. I mean, there are numerous tasks. I think it just develops over generations, I would say. And again, the commonality with Edwina that Rhiannon mentioned, you know, that social service. I mean, like her mother, there are accounts of Rana's mother, how she would always go out to people in need, carry food. And as a little girl, Irene would go along with her mother, and you know, the people in need, they called her a little bulbul, you know, because she was a sweet little girl. And they were so, you know, touched.
Nightingale.
Yes. So that is one thing. And also about duty, definitely she had a strong sense of duty and earnestness. And this is what I asked a couple of people who had, you know, met her. And I said, is there an earnestness about her? Because I noticed that in whatever she does. And this lady, Rati Sani, again, she said, you know, once she sent me a telegram saying, she was fond of sending telegrams. At that time, you know, communicating by phone was not so easy. Do something useful with your life. And I found that very intriguing that, you know, she would do that because Rati would, as Rati said, when she came, I'd take her to the hairdressers, I'd take her shopping, I'd help her get her gararas. You know, she was famous for her beautiful gararas. And I'd help her get her garara stitched. And she sends me this telegram, do something useful with your life. So there is that sense of purpose in life.
In Pakistan, Tehmina, how would people look on this background she brought with her, both to the Pakistan movement and to Pakistan itself, this mountain spirit, sense of independence, and deep sense of public service?
Actually, sadly, I think this is where this book is very crucial, because a lot of people don't know any of this, or of her background. I mean, as young people in school, we read of these few Pakistani or Muslim women leaders who were, foremost or in the movement. And Begum Rana Liaquat Ali Khan, nobody knew her background, and didn't know a lot of things that are said in Deepa's part. So I think it was a great idea to put this book together as a kind of history book for even children in Pakistan, to know her background and how it was a 180-degree movement from being a Christian.
Yeah, and I think the great thing about this book and both books, it's not written by some boring man who's looking at only the things their husbands were doing, but actually looking at the person behind the woman and who has a personality and a life of her own. Despite all the hardships and the ups and downs their marriages went through, and their personal and the personal stresses they suffered. But do you feel that Rana Liaquat Ali Khan's life has certain messages for India and Pakistan today? Deepa, okay, Deepa, you
let
first.
Deepa say, yeah. Go ahead.
Definitely, definitely about thinking there is more to life. I mean, I know I'm sounding very preachy here, that there should be something more than just having a good time, or making more money. That I mean, there are a lot of young people doing that. I know there are a lot of young people who are socially conscious. But again, there's also the other aspect of, how she could negotiate her life between two religions. So that, I feel, is something to be thought about. When I read her, the account of her marriage and all that, I thought how easily she was obviously very much in love with Liaquat Ali. And so how easily she adopted the name Gule Rana, gave up her given name.
So there's life beyond religion.
Yes, there's life beyond, absolutely.
I think he was a very forward-looking man. He was very modern, and she had a joie de vivre. She loved music. She loved playing instruments. She loved her game of bridge, and he never stopped her from any of these things.
She was also a great bridge player, apart from all her other attributes. Now, I'm sure there'll be many questions. So we have about 10 minutes. Okay, so yes, the gentleman in the front. First question to a man always.
Hello, I love the discussion here. Thank you so much for this. My question primarily is about the role of femininity in politics. So basically the undercurrent that goes throughout the conversation and through both of these amazing ladies is that they never were forefront in their roles, but somehow their actions affected politics in a very profound manner. Okay. So how does femininity sort of flow into politics in that sense?
We'll begin with you, Roy.
Was he asking about community?
Femininity.
Femininity. Sorry. Feminism. Okay. I think with Edwina, when you read the histories, there's a lot of commentators and people that were there that will say that Edwina was crucial to Mountbatten's work and negotiation with the Muslim League and Congress. And Mountbatten himself actually wrote about this. He said that he couldn't have worked in the manner that he'd done because without Edwina. The previous viceroy had been a bit of a bore. Now, Edwina was very, very, very good with people. She got on really well with people. So she was a great facilitator. And I think there's a lot of evidence that by her femininity and her personality, was able to keep people talking And my own sense is that actually without Edwina and her relationship with Nehru, perhaps the negotiation for the transfer of power might have broken down. So I think she was a power behind the throne.
See, actually, Rana, as a person, was a great believer in the central role of a woman as a homemaker. And she played it to the hilt. And she always advocated to all girls, you know, when even talking about emancipation, economic empowerment, that keep a balance and try not to lose the fact that you are a mother and a homemaker also. And then, of course, there was the Islamic aspect, which she would also stress sometimes, a little too much sometimes, about the role of a woman as advocated by Islam. But I feel that, yes, she was, her role in politics was never hindered by these kinds of thinking. She was very, very independent. She held her own. She said what she thought. She traveled everywhere. And yet, that intrinsic woman in her was very much there. And her dress was one of the manifestations. She always had a scarf around her head, a long dress, and a little bit of ornaments, which she loved. So there was a balance.
Deepa?
Yes, you know, I think she was a very feminine woman, but she never hesitated to speak out her mind. And I think her femininity sort of softened the, you know, the harshness or whatever she might be was saying. Some, you know, she may have been making some harsh statements. And if you read her speeches, you can see in her later interviews, she was very extremely outspoken. But because she had that image, that soft image, that, you know, that pleasant smile, and, you know, people have talked about how when she entered a room, the place seemed to light up with her presence. So I think that way she was able to help her husband too, because, you know, she traveled the world widely with them, and there's even a photograph with Walt Disney in the book. So I think that is what she was able to affect, you know, keep things pleasant and smooth, even when something hard was being negotiated.
So women are better at handling difficult situations. And that is something which many people have commented on, especially about Rana Liaquat Ali Khan. Any other questions? Yes, yes, at the back.
Hello. I wanted to ask that when we compare these two women, Edwina and Rana, the one major difference is that Rana had to settle in an environment that was very new to her because she adopted another religion because of which the two nations were divided. So I want to know that how was she accepted in Pakistan when she first went there? Because that wasn't the case with Edwina. She was already an accepted countess, whereas Rana had to make her way through, if I'm not wrong.
Can I just make a quick point there? Edwina actually did, I'm not going to steal, she did actually struggle. Edwina married, in a sense, into the royal family. Lord Mountbatten was the great-great-grandson of Queen Victoria, so she was a commoner, and she was always very uncomfortable, a bit like Princess Diana in the British establishment. It's not the same as religion, but she did marry into an environment that she struggled with, very much so.
And was she Jewish also?
She was half Jewish as well, yes. So there is some overlap in that both of them married into establishments, if you want to call it that were not their own.
You see, yes, of course, you're absolutely right in that there wasn't, for her, a new environment and also a rigid environment, so to speak. And what she was trying to do was actually bring women out into the public arena because they were needed. There was a state of emergency. There was a health sort of emergency, and she needed all kinds of people to help. And there was criticism as to what she was doing. Why was she making all these women come out of their homes? And a lot of press, bad press and so on initially. And in fact, it was her husband who stood up in many forums and said, you know, how can you do this to her? She is trying to bring people out to help others. She's not taking them to dance halls or to, you know, other such frivolous activities. That right now women are needed in the public space. So luckily, she was able to tide over that because of the environment at that time being of a particular nature.
We have time for... Yes, yes.
I just would like to address this question to you. It's maybe a tricky question, but do say you don't want to answer it. Would you think that the personal relationship between Edwina Mountbatten and Nehru, do you think it played out in India's advantage when it came to the division of the subcontinent India in what we call Pakistan today and India today?
I know exactly what you're talking about. And this is a very tricky question, and it's a $1 million question and a much asked question, but not much answered because there's really no proof. Those last minute negotiations, I think it was more Sir Ratcliffe deciding the lines, and I don't know if Sir Mountbatten had so much of a role to play, or even Edwina. So yes, there are conspiracy theories that if this had been here and not here, you know, Pakistan would have been different, or Kashmir would have had, Pakistan would have had access to Kashmir. All of, and really these are all in the realm of speculation. One can't really put one's finger on it and say.
We can discuss it till the cows come home.
Yes,
Exactly, cows.
Any other question? Yes, yes, ma'am.
Where would these women have been if they had not been married to the men they were? Would we be here talking about them?
Wonderful question. Where would Edwina have been if she had not married Mountbatten? And Deepa, where would Rana have been? Would she have still been, would she have been Professor Irene Pant, maybe member of the Planning Commission?
I absolutely, can I answer first? Absolutely. I think she would have been very prominent in public affairs. She would have probably begun by becoming the principal of Indraprasth College and risen to greater heights. Because, you know, she had that go in her. You can see it in her right from the beginning. And I think it was a chance encounter with Liaquat Ali Khan because she was already, you know, getting into the freedom movement. And
Already,
the freedom, yes, and the freedom movement was a movement that brought so many women out into public life. I'm convinced she would have been in public life if she hadn't met.
And where would Edwina have been?
I think, well, she was she was very rich. She had a load of money in her own right. Her grandfather was a banker. She would have probably disappeared into obscurity, been a rich socialite who jet-setted or yachted around the world, probably a bit like a Jackie Onassis type, possibly. Yeah, I think she would have disappeared into obscurity. I don't think she had the intellectual caliber of it. She wasn't anywhere as well educated as Rana. So, yeah.
Any other? Yes, yes, yes.
Hello everyone. The definition of feminism changed over time. Today, the women want to be on the throne rather than being a throne maker, rather than being a king maker. What do you want to say about that?
That, you mean to say, why were they always in the background?
Yes, like today, the women want to be on the front. So, what do you want to say about that?
So have times changed? That are these people dated?
I think they were part of a process that they were women who were a product of their time, and without their work, we as women wouldn't be where we are today. I would say Edwina Mountbatten was very impressed when she came to India by the women in public life that she met, like Rana, like Maniben Patel, like Amrit Kaur. She was very impressed by these women, and she wrote that she had great hope for women in public life. She thought that actually women's participation in government or in the Muslim League and Congress was much better than in the UK. I think if she looked at India today and women's participation in the parliament, she would perhaps be a bit disappointed.
Disappointed.
Yes.
Deepa, would you like to?
See, well, you know, definitely these women laid the grounds for the women of today. But still, I feel there is a long way to go in our country, especially. And then you have to think of the other aspect, the women who are out with jobs, careers, on the roads, in the buses. They are fighting a different kind of battle, and the young women present here, or the older women, know exactly what I'm meaning when you talk about the Me Too movement. I don't want to bring it up, but I think this is what women have to continue to fight. The battle isn't over. It continues.
Yeah, I just wanted to
We
add
have
here.
half a minute. Yeah.
I just wanted to add here that, as far as Rana Liaquat Ali Khan is concerned, she was really responsible directly for the fact that there was a representation of women in parliament as early as the early 50s. And now in Pakistan today, you have a 33% representation in local bodies and a 25% representation in the national bodies. And the other thing she did in the 1962 was institute, through Ayub Khan, an ordinance which took care of the Islamic family laws of triple talaq, etc., etc. And after that, it's not allowed in Pakistan anymore. Women have to give the permission for the second marriage to the husband. And a 3-month mandatory period is required for the divorce. So as early as 1962, Apwa and Begum Rana Liaquat Ali Khan drafted a new law, made Ayub Khan pass it as an ordinance, and it's there now. It's called the Ayub Khan family laws.
So do read both these books, ladies and gentlemen, because they are wonderful stories about two very, very interesting personalities who were also women. Thank you very much. I think we're clean out of time.
Please join me in thanking our wonderful panel for a fascinating session. We'd like to present each of you with a lovely scarf. And our wonderful authors will be joining us for a book signing at the top of the ramp just outside the Samvad tent. Thank you so much.
And I want a special clap for our friend Tehmeena, who made her way from Pakistan all the way here, one of our Pakistani guests, co-author.
कला में अपने आप को खोजो।